RSIS webinar series on the post-pandemic multilateralism and diplomacy. This is the first of the 3 sessions in this series. We'll be focusing on the COVID-19 and great power competition. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Karen Pitakdamrongkit, the Deputy Head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies at RSIS. I'll be moderating this session. The COVID-19 pandemic has been posing multiple challenges to countries around the world. To some observers, the COVID-19 begets opportunities for cooperation as it makes states realize that multilateral effort is needed to jointly tackle the challenges. However, others argue that the pandemic tempts states to act in their self-interest, which can cause tensions among themselves and undermine multilateralism. Speaking about the great power competition, which is the topic that we'll be discussing today, it has been amplified since the pandemic. This factor will very much affect the development of the inclusive and rules-based order. So against this backdrop, this panel seeks to explore questions such as, to what extent has the pandemic impacted great power relations or created the new fault lines? Has the COVID-19 advanced China's regional leadership in Asia? Has COVID-19 harmed the US Indo-Pacific plans? And how will a new President Joe Biden change US policy toward multilateralism in Asia? And last but not least, what kind or what form of multilateralism could replace the version that so many people have lost faith in it before the COVID-19? We now have 3 distinguished experts with us today who will help shed light on these issues. The first one is Dr. Beverly Logue, lecturer in International Relations, University of Essex, UK. The second one is Professor Gao Jian, Senior Researcher and Secretary General of Shanghai Academy of Global Governance and Area Studies at Shanghai International Study University in China. And last but not least, we have Professor Brad Glosserman, Deputy Director and Visiting Professor at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University in Japan. He is also Senior Advisor at Pacific Forum. Each speaker will talk for 15 to 20 minutes. This will be followed by a Q&A session. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box below, and I will select and read them to our speakers whom will answer your inquiries. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to Dr. Beverly for her analysis. Beverly, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Karen. I've just started sharing my screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, great. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and thanks very much to CMS and also to RSIS for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be a part of it. So my brief here was to examine how and to what extent the pandemic has impacted great power relations, the extent to which it has reinforced regional trends or power balance trajectories. And so what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to suggest that in examining great power dynamics, we are better served by a sensitivity to, and indeed an acute awareness of, regional complexities, recognizing that simplistic or binary models no longer hold, and that regional order is evolving and will continue to evolve in ways that resemble coalitional and collaborative hegemonies operating in a complex hierarchy. And I'll seek to illustrate this by highlighting 3 key regional trends: how COVID-19 has reinforced some of these certain trends in great power politics, but also how the Biden administration offers better prospects to manage or perhaps even reverse some of these. So let me start with the sort of the broader conceptual argument. If we zoom out and more broadly map the key conceptual lenses that we have applied to great power dynamics and regional hegemonic ordering, I think we see 4 main logics, right? And let me just very quickly walk you through them. So logic 1 is a very US-centered narrative. This is one that focuses on the pivotal role that America has played in maintaining regional order. It's a narrative that emphasizes US liberal hegemony and the benefits of America's deep engagement strategy. But I think it also downplays the challenges of a rising China. It gives us, I think, a very liberal, maybe an overly liberal reading of US hegemony, in ways that were called into question under the Trump administration. The second logic is similar in the extent that it looks at the US as a single hegemon embedded within this broader hierarchical structure, but we see greater stratifications within this hierarchy. And so according to this logic, the US still occupies top spot, but it's followed by China, Japan as key regional powers in the second tier. My issue with this logic is that it assumes China's position as a status quo second-tiered power. And I think we can all agree that it's perhaps highly questionable whether China is content with this status and positionality as a junior partner in a US-led regional order. And I think it calls very fundamentally into question assumptions about a linear socialization trajectory here. The third logic is one that emphasizes predictions of great power war, hegemonic contest, and transition. And it very much seeks to highlight some of the counter-hegemonic projects that China has undertaken over the years. But I think it doesn't take into account the broader ideational and social capital that is necessary for a successful hegemonic transition. So things that come into mind here are, leadership followership, the notions of regional endorsement that very much comes into play here. I think when you look at what's actually happening, what's actually coming out from the ground, there are some very real anxieties about China's influence within the region. And I think for me, this strongly highlights that even though there is overwhelming recognition of China's regional power, receptivity is far more ambivalent. And any kind of hegemonic succession between the US and China, I think, remains still quite premature. The fourth logic is the dual hierarchical model. And so power and spheres of influence here are disaggregated into the economic and then the political security domains, with China largely perceived to dominate the East Asian Indo-Pacific economic hierarchy, while the US does so for the political security hierarchy. And I think in some ways, this logic rightly recognizes, China's growing economic might and influence within the region. But in reality, I think it's quite difficult to draw the line between geoeconomics, geopolitics, and geostrategic boundaries, which are, I think, far more blurry within the region. If we look at regional dynamics, I think, again, they're far more fluid, far more complex than the kinds of bifurcated order that are presented in the dual hierarchical model. So on the whole, I think each of these logics captures an important part of great power dynamics and regional hegemonic ordering, but at the same time, they tend to frame the debate in fairly simplistic terms. So if you look at logics 1 to 4, an overly liberal reading of US hegemony, a linear Chinese socialization trajectory that I think is largely no longer defensible. Logic 3, a structurally deterministic prediction of hegemonic contest and great power war. And then logic 4, a dual hierarchical model that I think is too binary for what we're seeing on the ground right now. And so whilst these different logics acknowledge the politics of hegemonic ordering at varying levels, they do not push it far enough. And so across these logics, I think, is a neglected consideration of complexity and evolving dynamics. And so what I'd like to suggest is the fifth logic, one of coalitional and collaborative hegemonies operating in a complex hierarchy. I think this better captures what we see on the ground, which is a sort of a hybrid regional order that is anchored in assertiveness, fluidity, and compartmentalization, one that recognizes the competitive cooperative dynamic in US-China relations, but also the intensification of the politics of hegemonic ordering as they seek legitimation from multiple and often overlapping constituencies. So to examine this empirically, I'd like to zoom into how the pandemic has reinforced three key regional great power trends. And the first, I believe, is an intensification of the US-China strategic competition. I think we can all agree that pre-COVID, US-China relations were at its lowest in decades. Within the US, very much this bipartisan consensus that the sort of liberal logic that has guided US engagement towards China is largely now flawed, right? And that a harsher US-China policy is required. And so one would have thought that, with the arrival of a global pandemic, this would offer an opportunity for, China and the US to come together for joint pandemic cooperation and even leadership on the global level, but this didn't materialize, right? If we take from Hedley Bull, the English school scholar, the notion that great powers have special responsibilities to manage their relations, right? But also to impart a central kind of direction in the orchestration of world affairs, then we see that quite clearly in both of these domains, China and the US have shirked rather than shouldered their managerial responsibilities, and perhaps may even earn the bullion term of being the great irresponsibles. And so instead of coming together to rally multilateral efforts, they have been locked in a blame game, in blame politics, trying to control the strategic narrative and redirect blame through disinformation campaigns and scapegoating. So Trump, very much continued his antagonistic approach to China. And in response, we saw coming out of China a bolder, more aggressive messaging as evidenced by Beijing's wolf warrior diplomacy, a more confrontational rhetoric, more openly mocking US pandemic mismanagement. But I think where Biden comes in, we can see with the Biden administration, I believe strategic competition will continue. But I think it will be better managed, guided by a more coherent policy and one that recognizes avenues for cooperation on shared interests. The second key trend that I want to highlight is the assertiveness responsibility nexus in China's foreign policy. And so this centers on the multifaceted nature of China's foreign policy and the ways in which assertiveness and responsibility interplay here. So this is a China that has not been hesitant, right, to push back when its core interests are in question. So assertiveness, not just in terms of sharper rhetoric or its intensified activities in the South China Sea and also perhaps towards Taiwan, but it's also not shy to use its economic leverage to introduce more coercive measures, as we've seen in the case of Australian wine and beef imports. At the same time, this is a China that remains fundamentally quite sensitive to its regional image and to projecting, this kind of responsible great powerness in its foreign policy. I think this is particularly important for a country for whom status, regional and global perceptions very much plays into notions of legitimacy, plays very much into the notion of autocratic legitimation back home, domestically as well. So we see in the context of COVID-19, Beijing utilizing various bilateral and regional fora to positively highlight its pandemic responses, to shore up regional legitimacy, and also in a way to use that, right, to inoculate itself against escalating global criticism. So we also saw very well publicized modes of proactive benevolence. So in the case of mass diplomacy, aid to Africa, and then more recently as well, vaccine diplomacy, to emphasize China's responsibility and global solidarity under the banner of building a community with a shared future for mankind. But I think it's also important to recognize that there remains significant mistrust and distrust of China. And I'd like to flag the State of Southeast Asia survey here that was just released last week and conducted by the IC's Yusuf Ishak Institute. Now, this survey only canvasses responses from Southeast Asia, but I think it's quite indicative of broader Indo-Pacific regional perspectives. And for me, I think what is really interesting to note amongst many of the questions in the survey is that even though China is seen to have done more for the region, Southeast Asia, in providing COVID-19 assistance, regional distrust, as you can see from the slide here, remains really high and actually, in fact, has increased, right, over the last 3 years. So China in red here is seen in the survey to be the least trusted and most distrusted major power. And I think for me, this really nicely demonstrates the complex nature of regional perceptions and relationships that states have with China. Having said that, though, China is the only major country to be coming out of COVID, or at least have ended 2020 in a relatively good shape, right? Bouncing back in its COVID economic recovery, and the projections for 2021 are set to continue. And so given that China's economy is doing relatively well compared to others, I think many regional states will also be leaning in a little bit more, right? As they themselves are struggling, trying to recover from COVID-19, needing Chinese investment in infrastructure and looking to China to boost their own domestic economic recovery. Okay, the final trend that I want to highlight is diminished US regional standing. So regional concerns about the extent to which US is committed to the region are not new. But I think under the Trump administration, we saw an elevated concern coming out from the region about US commitments. And so the nationalistic agenda under Trump's America First, domestically, the kinds of the deep political and social fissures, globally reneging on many multilateral commitments and institutions, and the fact that many people around the world viewed its pandemic responses as ineffective, hugely flawed, demonstrating both a lack of capacity and willingness to provide global stewardship. And so I think this fundamentally resulted in a huge reputational damage for the US, a legitimacy deficit within the region. It reinforced perceptions of a declining and disengaged US from the region. And perhaps also, in some ways, the pandemic has also ceded regional power and leadership to China. But this particular last trend, I think, these perceptions of a shift in the power balance, I think, can be reversed. And a lot of it hinges on the Biden administration to repair and reassure in terms of America's regional and global standing. And in many ways, I think we're beginning to see this occurring as well, right? If we examine some of the more recent regional sentiment and signaling, and again, if I can draw your attention to the State of Southeast Asia survey on the bottom right here, that was conducted after the US presidential election last November. And so obviously it's still early days here, but you can see that the region believes US engagement will be elevated under the Biden administration. It's actually a significant rise here compared to the year before. Also, a very substantial rise in terms of regional perceptions of the US as a reliable strategic partner and provider of regional security. And so I think regional states will clearly welcome a more committed, a more engaged US to the region, but regional states will still very much remain largely wary of any explicit anti-China coalitional bloc. And they still want to hedge and not necessarily be pressured to choose sides between China and the US. Okay, so where does this leave us? So as I've just mentioned, I think COVID-19 has sharpened three key regional great power trends. But I think the new Biden administration raises prospects of better managing the first one on US-China strategic competition and possibly reversing the third one in terms of its diminished US regional standing. I think what we're beginning to see coming out of the new Biden administration is perhaps a more textured approach to its to its China policy, right? As compared to Trump, a more textured approach, and also one that will be, more coherently, I think, embedded within a broader Indo-Pacific policy. So if I could just return to my initial conceptual mapping of how the region will be moving forward through this logic of coalitional and collaborative hegemonies, I think on the one hand, very much not downplaying the strategic competition between the two powers. I think we're going to be seeing both Washington and Beijing simultaneously seeking legitimation from various multiple and indeed overlapping constituencies. This is going to be grounded in assertiveness on both sides, a US that will continue to take a firmer approach to China, but also a more confident China that is perhaps wanting to do things on its own terms rather than necessarily be pinned down to a US-led definition of what regional order and regional ordering looks like. So a China that is more explicitly articulating its vision of regional order and is actually finding some endorsement from regional states. So on the one hand, a set of coalitional hegemonies, but on the other hand, also we can think about a collaborative hegemony between China and the US, one that is selective, that is driven by pragmatic considerations. And I don't mean any kind of collective hegemony in the sense of a G2 or a concert of powers, because I don't think we're going to be seeing that sort of institutionalized permanence that we might envisage in a collective hegemony. But so not quite comprehensive partners, more like pragmatic associates, underpinned by fluidity and compartmentalization, based on the recognition that the US and China will be strategically competing in certain areas, but that this shouldn't close off the opportunity to pragmatically collaborate in other areas. And I think this mixed sort of messy fluidity and hybridity in some ways will be appealing, right, to regional states as they themselves seek to balance an array of relationships with both Washington and Beijing. So I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to discussions later.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for your insightful analysis and the conceptual framework that you have given us, which help us think more about how US-China dynamics will be unfolded and how they will shape the regional order going forward. Now, let us turn to the second speaker. Professor Gao, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to attend this webinar. This is a very popular word now since we cannot meet with each other due to the pandemic. And talking about the pandemic, the coronavirus, actually, it was about 1 year ago, the most hot time in China. I still remember just a few days after the last Spring Festival. It's really a hot time, but we survived. And what does 2020 mean for human beings' history? We are still remaining in uncertainty to know what does that mean. And my personal view is that actually, if we dating back to 2008, what does 2008 mean to China, to the world because of the financial crisis? I do have the view that we haven't stepped out of the time of 2008, but now we have 2020, the pandemic time. And I don't think there's to some degree, there's no exaggeration to say we would probably, the human beings would probably step into a time of pandemic area, because actually the influence of pandemic is ubiquitous, not only politically, economically, but also I think culturally. I will elaborate on culturally much more than the previous two. And so actually, I think the pandemic, the coronavirus, in my view, is a philosophical question. Think about it. Our human beings, we have been stepping into a post-modernization time. We human beings are so much proud of our achievements. However, we are so easily defeated by an invisible enemy that we cannot see even by our eyes. So how ironic it is, how breakable, how fragile, and how vulnerable our system is. So this is really a philosophical question, isn't it? Now let me illustrate my view about the influence of pandemic from three perspectives. First, economically. China, definitely. So far, China, according to the statistics, is the only primary and major economies in the world that had the rise in 2020. And so far, we are really facing a time, the world is really facing a time of slow economic growth. But hopefully, when we are successfully tackling the pandemic, we will have a promising recovery worldwide. However, even in 2020, and China has taken some very specific measures to improve our economic robustness. For example, we are very successfully finished with our boarding countries, particularly with ASEANs. We finished the RCEP. This is a very important step for the regional economic cooperation and for the combination, for the for that kind of our shared future economically for China and for the Asia. And also simultaneously, nearly simultaneously, we finished our discussion with the EU, and we have the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement. This is a very important agreement. According to some Western media, this is regarded as a kind of EU's betrayal against the Western culture, because they thought that EU was too impatient because they cannot wait for the new government of US, and they just signed the agreement with China. But actually, it was a time of 7 to 8 years we have the negotiation, and finally we got the agreement. That is a very high standard investment agreement, and with a lot of terms that indicate that China would be more and more open-minded and more cooperative in terms of international trade and economic cooperation. And this is what happened in 2020 in China economically. But worldly speaking, we can see that in talking about the pandemic influence, we can see two very contrasting trends. On the one hand, we can see that a lot of discussions about how to secure the domestic and the national manufacturing lines, because some nations found that our pandemic showed that even their own manufacturing system cannot ensure they could produce some important facilities to tackle the pandemic. So which realized that the importance of the national safety or insurance of the completion of manufacturing. And however, on the other hand, we can see that there's a very urgent and very obvious need for the more and more I would like to say encouraging globalization. For example, you can see very interesting is in 2020, according to the statistics, although Trump government made the trade war with China for the past 4 years, but however, ironically, the bilateral trade amount still rose up by a certain percentage between China and the US. That indicates that it seems that our world system economically cannot be so easily cut off. And even according to the statistics, more than 90% of the US companies in China, they want to enlarge their investment. And at the Wall Street still have a growing interest in investing in China. So you can see that what I'm going to argue is that economically, globalization is really unstoppable. Although we do have a lot of new considerations about how to go with globalization. Even China want to argue is that we should not have the theoretically absolute globalization. The globalization should go like inclusive and creative. So the globalization should be enjoyed by all participants. And how to stick to the point and make globalization enjoyed by all the participants, particularly for the developing countries. This is really a question for us to face in the future. And talk about China and the ASEANs. Actually, our ASEAN China in 2020, we have developed into mutually the largest partner in trade. It's like 4.5 trillion China yuan between China and the ASEAN. That's really a fantastic achievement. My prediction is that the amount will grow dramatically in the future, particularly after RCEP. And it indicates that China, in terms of globalization, in terms of economic shared future, China's priority concern is how to strengthen the economic cooperation, economic relationship with Asian countries, particularly with ASEAN. That is what I have observed. So you see what happened in terms of economy. I think we have good news and also we have bad news. Politically, I was invited by the Center for Multilateralism. So here I want to talk about multilateralism. As it is quoted, multilateralism has been very much devastated in the past 4 years because America take American interest first, not multiculturalism interest first. WTO, WHO, Paris Climate Agreement, they are all thrown into trashy classics. This is really a very sad message and a tragic message for the multilateralism. But however, we can still see politically, particularly in terms of the new government in USA, the Biden government, according to their latest released speech, they are very interested in multiculturalism. So hopefully, particularly in terms of tackling pandemic, something like pandemic, we say global governance, multilateralism is an indispensable choice for the world, for the human beings. So as we say, we do have the shared future. We have the full sense of the shared future, since no single country can tackle something like a pandemic very successfully, because every country is not or is not an isolated island. We are connected with each other more and more. So in this sense, China would like to call for, you can see there's a very strong consistency in China's policy in terms of multilateralism, and in Xi's governance, you can see ever since 2012, Xi on a lot of international occasions speak for the importance of multilateralism. However, according to the recent speech, as she pointed out, multilateralism should be one that welcome all the participants. A selective multilateralism is not the solution for multilateralism. So in this sense, China would call for cooperation instead of confrontation. China still keep very more and more open-minded to world cooperation and always be patient to listen to different voices. So our mutual respect is highly important. Always double standard is not welcome. And frankly speaking, for example, Britain recently got a failure in trying to enlarge in G7 into G10, so-called make kind of democracy coalition. Challenging with China's rise. This actually was strongly opposed to by some participants like Germany, France, and Italy. This is very ironic. So to be very frank, in 2021, we still talk about how to make some kind of coalition in the name of democracy. This is very much old-fashioned and out of date, in my opinion. And so our multiculturalism should be participate and be open-minded to welcome all the participants. Never say labeled with kind of sign of ideology is welcome. This is absolutely very harmful to dealing with the future problems of humankind. And I'm talking about culturalism. I'm talking about cultural respect. Well, pandemic, as I have extended, a pandemic is a philosophical question. But pandemic, culturally speaking, is really a very, very interesting subject for us to think over about the difference of cultures. In China, our last year during this period of time, we were in a very harsh time, very, very difficult time. But I personally do have the full confidence. I know how competent the government is. I know, although we would make an economic sacrifice, we would succeed in tackling the pandemic. But it's really, how to say, out of my imagination to see what happened later, worldly speaking. Or in China, people nowadays, I'm not talking about a scholar group, not talking about government level, but if you go to China, talk with the most ordinary Chinese people, talking about what do you think of the pandemic? What do you think of what happened in America? And very ordinary Chinese people would say, oh, it's really a shocking time. America is such a world leading power. How could they deal with the problem, the pandemic, in such a very, very horrible way with such a huge casualties? Now in China, nowadays, the ordinary people would have a very interesting discussion, although it's a little bit, how to say, inhumane, but it's now we talk about human rights. The Western people always talk about human rights, but without human beings, how can we say human rights? This is a very, very frank question. This is a very easy question, but really difficult to answer for the theorists. So culturally speaking, pandemic indicates that Chinese culture in terms of the social governance really demonstrate a very strong tenacity or flexibility in dealing with the problems like a pandemic. This is really demonstrating the Chinese people's cultural characteristics. And I do have some familiarity with Western culture. So I was not surprised when Boris Johnson in Britain talked about, we have to undergo some casualties for most of the families. We should be ready for that because of this, because of that. And I read it out. This is absolutely social Darwinism. Now we know social Darwinism says, okay, the survival of the best, the choice of the fittest. So the elderly people's choice is to go to die. This is really callous, senseless for the Chinese culture. So according to the statistics, above 90%, more than 90% of the casualties in America, they are elderly people. This is absolutely unacceptable for Chinese culture. In China, we spend a lot of money in saving an old person's life well above 80, well above 90. Why? Because we think this is what we should do. This is a Chinese, we say, social contract. Okay, so what I'm going to argue is that pandemic demonstrate the cultural diversities, and the pandemic also indicate that maybe it's time to have a further and deeper discussion about the appropriation of the choice of the social governance. And we say the best choice for a country's social governance style must be responsible to the social characteristics. And different cultures have different social governance styles. Okay, we gain from that and we pay for that. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gao, for your analysis. You not only show us the Chinese perspective on the COVID-19, but also walk us through how this pandemic impact countries economically, politically, and culturally. Then now, for the interest of time, let us turn to the last speaker, Brad. Brad, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pity we're not in Singapore. There's a lot of ground to cover after hearing the academic theorizing of Professor Loic and then Professor Gao's philosophizing. I'm going to be just a plain man, salt of the earth, policy person and just throw some very simple, hopefully short words, short language, short ideas, more questions than answers for the audience. And I'll try to do very quickly so that we can have time for discussion. So I promise you far more cryptic headlines, if you will, to be filled in upon request. Though I apologize in advance if anything is not as complete or as sharp as it should be. I just, there's very little to disagree with, certainly with what Beverly said. But Professor Gao and I probably need to have a longer discussion and maybe some drinks. So but I have a feeling that he and I are going to be differing far more than Beverly and I will. I think she captured very well the dynamics of the region and understands certainly US and Chinese position. So I'll be repeating briefly what she said. I think, the problem is we're playing catch up. We're moving towards a new normal and we don't know where it is. And we're on a transition in the region and the world on so many different levels. And it's just very, very hard to put all of the pieces of this dynamic evolution transformation in place. I think to start out that a lot of the future depends pretty much on how we assess right now where we are. Let me offer you my thoughts. Number one, US hard power is still quite formidable. Number two, our economic strength persists. And I was just noting the Bank of International Settlements noted that the Federal Reserve acted as the world's lender of last resort, dwarfing the IMF's capacity in this area to help out on the pandemic relief. So we still have the economic power. Was Donald Trump a problem? I think in some ways, many of us were offended by his actions and by the way that he spoke. But in fact, for many regional governments, which is what we're focusing on here, I think there was far more approval of Mr. Trump's policies and less concern than, frankly, the pearl clutching that folks like myself and maybe some of the other academics may have indulged in. I think they liked, quite frankly, his harder line against China. And mainly as it was advertised, not necessarily as it was enacted. I think it was viewed as being too transactional, too mercurial, and too ad hoc. I think protectionism is definitely problematic. His unilateralism was offensive, but nevertheless, that spurred other governments to fill the gap. And I think as the emergence of RCEP and the CPTPP, I think is proof, if you will, of stimulating other nations to act as well. Consistent with what Beverly said, there has already been a rebound in views of the US, and I too looked at the IC study. I was taken by the 61.5% of respondents who would align with the US over China, which is about an 8% increase from the 2020 survey, and the 38.5% who only picked China, which is down from 46.4%. So you've already seen a rebound in assessments of the views of the United States. And of course, again, as was noted, President Biden is walking the walk. He's talking about, he's talking the talk. He talks about cooperation, multilateralism, prioritizing allies, and he walks the walk. He's rejoined Paris, rejoined the WHO, lifted the black ball of the new Director General of the WTO, which has now been voted into office. So we're seeing, I think, genuine shift in views. The perception of US competence, as was also mentioned, is difficult, but I think we can fix that. Clearly, the way we botched the handling of the pandemic, that can be sorted up, but it's more than just politics at work here, and it goes to some larger structural and issues within the country that I think will pop up and need to be discussed later. As I look at geopolitical trends of note for the region, I would say, number one, there is an idea and some reality, this notion of US overextension, fighting of forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though some of them may be drawing down. I'm not sure how far that will go. There is a sense of exhaustion in the United States that we see and hear. This is not, however, isolationism, but I do think it will manifest itself in a more judicious engagement and a different thinking about foreign policy, which I'll get to in a minute. Second, again, as Beverly noted, we have China's confidence. I think the wolf warriors are going to be with us for a while. And part of this, and I think this is important, and I'll come back to it, that there is a justifiable sense or desire in China to rewrite regional and global orders to reflect Chinese preferences. This is a system that was created largely without China. And now that, regardless of the fact that it has benefited Beijing and benefited the people of the country, they still would like to have more say in writing the rules and creating the institutions. Where that compromise is met, how that is worked out, we're going to find to be, I think, one of the defining characteristics of this post-COVID world. I think we're seeing, third, a multidimensional competition that is going to ensnare all countries in various dimensions of their engagement. It's not just going to be military. It's not just going to be political. It's going to be economic. It's going to be cultural. It's going to be ideological. We're dealing with what I call a new national security economy that has ramifications that spread throughout all dimensions of societies, of countries. And I don't think we've really gotten a grip on what that consists of or what it will mean, what its implications are, neither in the public sector nor the private sector. Finally, importantly as well, I would say that there is a gap between the United States and its partners that is closing. And that partly this has to do, I think, with the success of the American model. And while some people talk about relative gains of other countries as suggesting that the US is being weakened, I have long argued that Washington and its allies and partners should say that it is precisely the successes of other countries, including that of China, we should look at as our own successes. It speaks to the viability, it speaks to the wisdom of a model in which all boats are allowed to rise in a framework that is inclusive, precisely as our Chinese friends would like us to be, rather than exclusive. And I think that's quite unique if you think about human history. But the gap that is closing in terms of capabilities, and especially on the military side, means that we're going to have new thinking about security architectures and the way that the United States relates with its security partners and allies. And I think that we're going to have to be rethinking roles, capabilities, and missions. We need to rethink responsibilities for security concerns. And again, to go back to the RSIS study, to me, one of the more interesting and intriguing dimensions is the complaint among Southeast Asians that one of their top concerns is ASEAN's effectiveness. 71.5% of respondents identified that as their top concern for the region. And in that, I think, speaks to precisely the readiness of ASEAN to move beyond the talk shop and to actually be able to affect outcomes. And the questions and the doubts that persist among its members and the elites of this particular group, I think are very important. I think, as Beverly noted, we are not going back in the United States. We are going to see a continuing competitive and tough eye towards China. The center of gravity in China policy has shifted, and that's been discussed, so I'll leave it at that. I think similarly, and again, this does not mean we're looking at engagement, but the Biden administration is going to be looking at a foreign and domestic policy that is more inwardly focused. It is going to be trying to rebuild national consensus so that with that foundation, the country itself will be stronger and more capable of acting both in hard and soft power ways in the region and in the world. So balancing those two sets, the need to look inward and at the same time, the need to engage in the rest of the world, it's going to be difficult. It's going to create a new equilibrium, and it's going to create some questions. So in the interest of wrapping up, let me just identify very quickly, and just to confuse you and to show you how short my attention span is, let me offer you just a bunch of different things that I'm going to keep an eye on that I think are going to be indicative in some ways in the short and long term about this competition. Number one, watch the US vaccination rollout, because this will be an evidence of the US competence in its restoration of a sense of capability. Today, I noticed on the Washington Post website, the last look, 38.8 million people have already been vaccinated. And that makes it, at least as of yesterday, one of the fourth largest numbers in the world. Second, watch how the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is rolled out. This speaks to a distribution of American presence, the way that it will be working with partners throughout the region, and the contributions that they can make to help consolidate and solidify the US hard security presence. That will be an important indicator of both the way the US is going to engage the region and the way that the region sees the US. Third, while Professor Gao is suspicious of the rollout of the G7. Frankly, I think the G7 is long past its sell-by date, and we should be coming up with another form of international engagement. So whether it becomes a G10, a D10, a T10, I think we need to look for and understand and keep an eye on what are these democracy coordination platforms, which is the larger question I'm going to come back to in a moment. Fourth, watch electronic currencies. We're seeing a Bitcoin spike in the last couple of weeks that is kind of curious and maybe just sort of odd, but I do think that it speaks to a larger question of faith in the US dollar as a reserve currency, and the spread ultimately of cryptocurrencies speaks to and is an indicator, if you will, of larger international confidence in the US as the seigniorage and its question of it being the dollar being the reserve currency. Fifth, how will we engage China to reform various international institutions? And I think that the way that that process occurs, and it will be different in each one of the institutions, and we will see it, I think, most notably, for example, in the WTO, when we talk about state capitalism, how is it that we acknowledge the legitimate concerns that China has about its exclusion in the formation of so many of these institutions and their rules, and how, in fact, do we, draw lines at what is and what isn't permissible, and according to whom? Sixth, I would keep an eye on what the new economic statecraft. This is a rich topic, and I know that Karen works on this as well, and I'd be interested in talking to her. But I think this whole idea of this new concatenation of policies and perspectives, and the whole concept of new economic statecraft is something that's going to be incredibly important in shaping the way that we engage and deal with, and the way that that plays out will shape the way that we look at the balance of power in a post-COVID world. Very quickly, seventh, the new global inequality debate. I think we're seeing a greater concentration of wealth in the aftermath of COVID. We're seeing what they call the K recovery. And the way that this debate plays out within the various international institutions will be an indicator, I think, of how the various power centers are seen. Environmental politics, particularly the salience of climate change. I would keep an eye on Europe as a bellwether insofar as I think Professor Gao's assessment of the comprehensive agreement on investment is a little brighter than I would give it. I think there's far more uncertainty as to what was agreed than than his remarks suggest. But I do think there will be some new tensions in the transatlantic relationship, and we need to watch what Europe does in regard to China, and that will be a tell, I think, in the nature of how the US deals with Europe, and if in fact there is a fracture. If in fact there is not, I think, a reasonable consensus between Europe and the United States, the way that the US then reorients, whether that means it shifts its attention to Asia or that encourages a sort of a tripartite world, will be very, very telling. Finally, in thinking about Professor Gao's comments, I just want to throw this out. I think that maybe we need to be thinking about what's going on between the United States and China, not as necessarily a great power competition, but certainly as an ideological competition or systemic competition, not between a rising power and a status quo power. And I think this is the Thucydides trap analogy is well overdone. But I do think we have to think of it as in terms of a liberal system and an illiberal system. And I do think that the simplification of the degree to which whether you're alive or dead is more important than whether or not you have human rights or not may not be as simple a statement as Professor Gao wants to make it. More importantly, and I'll just close with this because it speaks to the larger array of issues with which we're discussing, that to look at this as merely a great power competition between Beijing and between Washington, I think oversimplifies, and if you will, distorts what's going on, because it is in many ways a competition between the United States and many like-minded countries versus China and other like-minded countries. And I would suggest that that elevates and radically transforms the nature of the conversation that we're having. Because to make it merely about Washington and Beijing very much denies the agency of so many other countries that have a very, very profound stake in the way that the world and the region evolves. And in the absence of them engaging and recognizing their particular interests, I am very much afraid that they will be marginalized and that we will face the worst of all possible worlds, which is one in which we are truly atomized and we do not have this larger consensus among the countries that share beliefs and ideals and have the ability to shape a system when they work in a collaborative, cooperative way, instead of really acting as, if you will, discrete atomized actors. I hope that was coherent, but that's all I'm going to say, and I now look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brad, for your presentation, and thank you for giving us some ideas of what to watch going forward, and also for reminding us that there are some, not only we have to look at the rivalry amongst them, but also there's some part or some areas where we can foster collaboration. Okay, for the interest of time, we have about. For the interest of time, we have 30 minutes for Q&A. And as I mentioned earlier, that you in the audience can post your own question in the Q&A box here. I'm seeing 2 questions, and I think I'm gonna ask the first question first by Dr. Alan Chong, the head of the Center for Multilateralism Study at RSIS. So this is the question for Beverly. So in your logic of multipolar and multi-layer fluidity, do you believe that the pandemic, being a non-traditional security issue, has ironically empowered those great powers and middle powers and some small states who have well-honed soft power, like diplomatic, cultural, and economic instrument, not military resources? Does this mean Biden's America will be playing a catch-up for some time to China and even Japan? So, yeah.
Should I answer now?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Chung, for your question. Nice to see you as well. I take your question, or at least I understand your question, to be asking about whether, the pandemic has in a way increased China's soft power within the region. And if I understand that correctly, then I think yes and no. I think we've certainly seen China that has paid a lot more attention to cultivating, this soft power, responsible power image, and certainly in trying to have better control of the strategic narrative. So as I mentioned, a lot of its aid diplomacy has been very well publicized, and certainly, needing the recipients to kind of, have the kind of photographic opportunities as well, right? But I think there still remains, and I think I was trying to get at this in the graph that I presented by the RSIS survey, which is that I think China still very much fundamentally, despite these notions of aid diplomacy, there's still a lot of anxiety about China's broader intentions, and these are, and I'm thinking about here, geopolitical intentions. So I think for some countries like Pakistan, where China relations are pretty good already, then certainly I think the cultivation of soft power, of a responsible great power image might persist there. In the context of its vaccine diplomacy to Indonesia, a lot of it time will tell, right? I think perhaps it might strengthen Indonesia's relationship with China, but I think there still remains quite a bit of anxiety about China's geopolitical intentions, and I think it might be a little bit hard, right, to sort of disassociate and disaggregate the vaccine diplomacy from these broader anxieties about China's geopolitical intentions. So I don't necessarily think that the Biden administration will be catching up, so to speak, vis-a-vis China's soft power. And if anything, I think actually the Biden administration has, more of that legitimacy compared to China in that particular aspect.
Thank you very much, Beverly. Let us move to the second question by Dr. Joanne Ng, a research fellow at the Center for Multilateralism Study at RSIS. So Joelle asked this question to you, Beverly, and to Professor Gao as well. So he said that Professor Locke mentioned that China-US cooperation might proceed on specific issue areas rather than at the general level, which would remain competitive. And meanwhile, Professor Gao stated that multilateralism would have to be inclusive to work. So might there be a conflict of intentions if the specific issue areas that China and US can work together might sideline other actors, sorry, and given the enormous weight those powers have in the world affairs? Put another way, would they really need anyone else if they find areas on which they can work together? So this is for Beverly and Prof. Gao. And perhaps could I start with Prof. Gao to respond to this inquiry? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you can take a look at the question as well. It's on in the Q&A box.
Okay, no problem.
Yes.
Allow me to spend a few minutes in response
sure.
to Professor Grocery, because he speaks a lot about what I said. Actually, US, I never deny US is a power, a great power in the past, now, and in the future, because by a lot of our perspectives, US would remain a huge, great power in the world, and thanks to a lot of historical and present factors. But it does not mean the power is not changing. is not our can resume its coerciveness as much as in the past. And also talk about soft power. To be very frank, I think soft power is a very vague idea. Without hard power, where is soft power? Without China's economic influence, why the Center for Multilateralism would invite me to talk about China? Because of the economic influence. And economic influence does not mean just hard power. The rise of economic influence, the rise of hard power, if it is sustainable, there must be a soft power behind it. That is my opinion. And talk about the multilateralism, or as the question here goes, will China and the US make cooperation in facing with so many impending world problems? This is a very yes and no question for answer, because actually, frankly, I don't believe that Biden government would stick to the multilateralism, because by the nature of culture, by the nature of its politics, US is always seeking the hegemony, because they have a very strong, consistent hegemonic complex, which has been demonstrated by history and now. The reason US would like to talk about multilateralism, because it is weakening in influence. That is the fact, okay? And talk about the order, definitely China, the Chinese government never say we would change the order. The reason it was described as the changing power, because the previous dominant powers felt that their positions were very much kind of endangered because of the rise of new power. What China called for is a shared future. As I mentioned and stated, all the participants should join in the game, not selective, not biased, but all the participants. And talk about the democracy, or talk about the liberalism, talk about liberal. Allow me to instill kind of element of philosophy into this definition. Talking about the liberalism, talking about freedom. Do we only have one form of freedom in this world? Ask ourselves. We have Singaporean, we have Asian, we have Malaysian, we have Chinese, we have American, we have German, we have French. Ask ourselves, is that just we have only uniformed expression of freedom in terms of our value life? Definitely not. So talk about freedom, talk about liberalism. Never say just only one form of liberalism or one form of freedom in this world. Never impose your freedom, conception of freedom upon the other people's, because we are so different by culture. We would never say, I have to have my hair dyed. For a few weeks, I haven't had my hair dyed, so I have to go out. Or I have to, or take my dog for a walk because we need a walk. Or I have to do that. Why I should wear my mask? For the wearing mask, it takes a few months to talking about why I should wear a mask. This is, to be very frank, unimaginable in Chinese culture, because we know this is what we should sacrifice for the other people. Okay, so culturally, we are so different. So in talking about the cooperation between US and China, frankly speaking, we are facing, I think the government in China, they have going through the very fierce experience of Trump government. And they are, in my opinion, they are ready for any kind of competition to come if they want. Problem is, for the world, if we want a better world, we need cooperation, much more than competition. This is obvious. And but the Chinese culture understands the importance of cooperation, because we know the diversity of the world. We know the world is diversified because the Chinese philosophy talk about 5 elements of the world. But in the Western culture, their conception of the world is black and white, is exclusiveness. And that the right is in the hand of their culture, but the wrong is always on the opposite. So talking about multilateralism, I personally have my very strong doubt about it in terms of the participation of the USA, because so far USA is the most modernized culture and is the most, to be very frank, aggressive culture in the world. It has enjoyed freedom, enjoyed hegemony for such a long, long time, not used to cooperate with the others. They have their own voice. Thank you.
Okay, Beverly, would you like to respond to Joel's question?
Great. Yeah, let me just jump in. Thanks, Dr. For your question. I think very quickly, I think I don't see them as necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So I think we can see a US and China coming together, as I mentioned, to pragmatically collaborate on certain issues. I think some of the language coming out of the Biden administration very much over the last couple of weeks have clearly demonstrated this, right? So the phone call that he had with Xi Jinping, very much emphasizing the human rights dimension, right? And also in terms of South China Sea and Taiwan, but also opening up the avenue to say, well, the US is here to cooperate if it's in US interest, right? So I think there is that avenue, that scope for China-US selective cooperation. And I don't think this necessarily will be exclusive of others, right? So all the more so, I think there needs to be China and the US within, multilateral structures or multilateral arrangements, providing some kind of joint leadership, right, to rally collective action for these issues such as climate change, pandemic management, and also, nuclear non-proliferation. I think these are issue areas where we see both countries having shared interests, and it's on that basis that they can collaborate in other countries, which clearly affects, them as well. And I think this is all the more important because we haven't been seeing this kind of joint leadership over the last few years, and also because importantly, I think both countries lack that sort of sole legitimacy, right? So they both in their own ways have a legitimacy deficit. And so if they can come together and provide that kind of joint collective leadership, all the more so, again, cultivating greater legitimacy from others as well. Leave it there.
Thank you very much for your answer. Okay, let us move to the next question by Dr. Alan Chong. This is for Brad. So Dr. Alan said, I appreciate you drawing attention to the return of America to the Pacific under President Biden. But I must ask if you think the US is suffering from strategic policy exhaustion during the Trump years. The State Department had been demoralized and marginalized, and the US Department of Commerce has yet to be seen to be leading the revival of trade multilateralism. It is ASEAN, China, Japan, and some momentum from South Korea too, pushing RCEP and CPTPP. So how would you respond to that, Brad?
Sure thing. Also, if you don't mind, very briefly, I'd like to tackle the previous question from a different angle.
Sure.
Let's start with that. And I think, while Beverly again is right, that what we'll see is cooperation and competition. The real debate in the United States is exactly where we draw the midpoint, which will be prioritized, cooperation, or will we trade certain interests for others? The idea of a US-China condominium making decisions for the region without other nations scares the bejesus out of our allies and partners. And as somebody who lives in Tokyo and deals with our allies here on a regular basis, I promise you that terrifies them. And the US knows that. So while there are some very, very few issues that only Washington and Beijing can address together, such as strategic stability between them, even that conversation, because they're the only two countries that have nuclear weapons in that context, even that conversation makes our friends in Tokyo and Seoul nervous. And once we have a conversation, a chat in Beijing, we usually go to those two capitals to explain what we heard. So I think what you will see is very little of a genuine condominium and if you will, leadership again, as Beverly put it, but absolutely an attempt to bring our allies and partners in on that question. As to Alan's point about exhaustion in the US, number one, Alan, it's been a month, not even. Give the guy a break, man. It's too early to write the Biden administration off, okay? It's been, 3 weeks since they came to office. And I don't think, there wasn't strategic and policy exhaustion during the Trump years. I think there was just incoherence. And if you talk to people at state and you talk to people at commerce and other departments, yes, they're demoralized, but now they're really happy to get back to work and to do what they think they can do very well. So they're quite excited. So I think that you'll see the United States resuming, and you've seen that, of course, with the flurry of rejoining this and with that. I think one of the big questions, which I omitted, I'm sorry, I forgot to add, was precisely the degree to which the U.S. engages with regional multi-economic activities. And so I think that it's going to be a difficult walk because of this orientation and movement away from sort of a focus, if you will, on the middle class. But I think that, yes, you will see the U.S. becoming deeply engaged across, as they say, a whole of society and whole of the government approach. And finally, I have to respond. The comment of Professor Gao about the U.S. always seeking hegemony, I can't let that one go. I mean, again, I would just note that the hallmark of the international order since World War II was a collaborative system in which all countries were bound by the international rules and institutions and norms. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council were the United States, China, Russia, the UK, and France. And we were subject to those strictures as much as any other country. I just think that, the idea, we may have abused some of our power on occasion, but we were always willing to acknowledge that the system was all countries were equal and all countries participated equally. So I think that the notion that the US always sought hegemony is something of a canard and one that I just can't let slide.
Can I add in something?
Yes, please. Yes, please, if you'd like to respond.
Just 2 points. Allow me to emphasize a very important point. Actually, my view, the U.S. real competitor in the world in the future is not China, is U.S. itself. In China, we have a book. It says U.S. versus U.S. What happened in U.S. now demonstrated the fact. You see that? U.S. is divided by different interests of powers, the interest of group of interests, stand for different groups of interests. And the U.S. have the culture that, are autonomous culture, therefore very hard to make a united and joint efforts and a cohesion in terms of the policy. So the fact is, what I'm going to argue is that if you have a look at the close observation about the Biden policy, the Biden government just recently signed quite a few executive files to overthrow the policies of Donald Trump. However, have a look at it. Something like Donald Trump is on the far right side and Biden is on the far left side. But where is the neutral side? Where is the moderate side? Now in China, in the Asian countries, our culture is not like that. We should try to adapt to all these different interests and try to find the middle way. But the fact in America is that people fighting with people, different group of interest fighting with different group of interest. That is the most powerful, most dreadful enemy for USA, not China. That is the fact I'm going to point out. So I know US has the culture of enemy culture. You always imagine there must be kind of enemy in face of you, try to conquer it, try to defeat it. But the real enemy is US itself. And talking about hegemony, if not, so why not US just abandon the dollar system and try to make the world more fair financially with the participation of more varied kinds of currencies? How US could enjoy the privilege to issue so much dollar with a weak economy? Because of the hegemony in finance system, let's be very frank, okay? And how could you be respected? Because you have the very powerful military presence in the world with so many bases all world around. And also you have the really the first rate technology in the world. That is the three pillars for US hegemony. Let's be very frank.
Okay, all right. Okay, let us move to the next question by Dr. Henry Chan. I think he didn't indicate specific speaker, so I just throw the question to you all, and please feel free to jump in if you have something to say. So he says that in 2019, the nominal GDP of China was 66% of the US, and the COVID significantly narrowed the gap. Many economists are projecting that at the end of 2021, Chinese GDP will be more than 80% of the US, and the momentum is favoring China to be the largest economy by 2028. How will this new trend, in a way precipitated by COVID-19, affect your judgment of geopolitical trend in this part of the world? So anyone would like to take this question? Yes, maybe can I ask perhaps Beverly to take this question first?
Okay, I think thanks for the question. I think this would quite nicely fit within the framework of coalitional hegemonies that I mentioned, right? So it's undeniable that China's economic might, and even more so coming out of COVID-19 as the major economy that is doing relatively well. I think a lot of countries, as I mentioned, will lean in, and that economic might, the need to drive domestic regional growth, the need to engage China on infrastructure development and to boost its economy. I think that sort of language that China speaks to vis-a-vis, projects from like the BRI, for instance, all that will, perhaps be all the more so important, right, for a region that, will need serious recovery coming out of COVID. And so I think these geoeconomic leanings will see this through, various regional states, therefore aligning themselves a little bit more towards China. And so I think, China through that will be forming its own kind of coalitional hegemonies. Again, quite specific, right? It might only be dealing with particular economic issues. And then certainly, regional states have agencies. They will also be legitimating, US-led projects and hegemonies as well. So that's what I mean by we're going to be seeing these various coalitional hegemonies. And I think for me, one of the things that came out from the IC survey as well, that was really interesting is Cambodia, right? If you look at the 2020 survey, Cambodia was one of the key countries that was aligning itself towards China. But interestingly, for 2021, I think that margin has decreased, or it's actually aligning more towards the US. So I think there is a lot of fluidity in these sorts of alignments. And I think that's something that we will be seeing going forward.
Okay, thank you. And Brad and Prof. Gao, would you like to take this question?
Sure, I'll be very quick. Number one, I'm very skeptical about a lot of the statistics that come out these days regarding economic growth period. You've seen, I think the Japanese announced yesterday that they had 12% growth towards the end of last year. I think what that means is that we can expect a very, very powerful rebound as their economies recover. So that suggests that the trends are going to have to adjust themselves. And I think, again, if the US seems to be vaccinating quickly, so the economy may come back more quickly than otherwise expected. If in fact the Biden government is successful, and I'm hoping that it will be, on building back better, directing sort of its attentions and energies inward, then you'll see an even more greater intensification of economic energies. And I think you'll see greater innovation. We're thinking differently now about how we're going to address 21st century economic challenges. So we may see a stepwise shift in economic performance in ways that make the projections that were both of last week and last year and a couple of years ago outdated very quickly.
Okay. And Prof. Gao, would you like to add something?
I want to say that, frankly, I don't like the word coalition hegemony because, again, I want to emphasize China is not a nation who is habitual to or who is apt to pursue hegemony, because he's absolutely against the Chinese culture and the Chinese philosophy. And the rise of power does not necessarily mean the pursuit of hegemony. Hegemony is absolutely an element of ideology which comes from the Western culture, not the Oriental culture. Have a look at the difference between Oriental and Western culture. You can sense it very easily. And I also, Professor Glossary talk about Japan's economy recover. A few words about Japan. Actually, RB economic reform policy actually theoretically is successful. However, it's not feasible. Why? Have a thinking about it, because Japan, frankly speaking, Japan is stepping into its post-modernization culture. If you refer to some reports, study about Japanese society, you would understand the society in Japan has been very much transformed into a certain mode that is not appropriate for the rise of economy. This is also actually related to another subject I'm personally interested in. Why I say, or for the Western culture, something we must, for the Asian countries, we must learn is, if you have a look at what's the problem with the Western cultures, the leading capitalism cultures, what's wrong with their societies? The fact is obvious, because post-modernization culture demonstrate the horrible result of liberalism in the Western conception. Individualism is the core value of Western culture. The country who go further into liberalism, the more suffering they would take nowadays. Coronavirus has demonstrated the fact very, very clearly. And in this sense, I would like to say, I personally have a doubt about the rise of economy in the West, because only when they are as hardworking as the Orientals, as the Asians, only when they do have their devotion to the families as much as the Asians, could they possibly enjoy a better life than their previous years. If not, I think the decline is obvious. I'm talking about culture, not talking about politics.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I just would like to do a quick comeback to the hegemony statement here. And I think Dr. Beverly would like to have a say on that.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to just do a quick comeback. I should clarify that when I speak or when I use the term hegemony, I'm coming at primarily from an English school constructivist perspective. So a social understanding of hegemony, not one focused purely from a power political perspective. And so when I talk about hegemonies here, I very much come across this from looking at leadership, followership kind of dimensions and the kinds of regional endorsement that don't just focus on a power material sort of perspective. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And I think we have time for only one last question. If that's because we're about 4 minutes left. So perhaps just very, very quickly, I think there's a question from adjunct professor Richard Magnus. You are seeing it with me today that he's referred to the book, The Back Channel by William Burns. And he said that this book discussed the make or break moment for the American and its role, that American poses a massive test for American statecraft. So he has multiple questions. So question one is how massive is it? Question two is about China's statecraft is also evolving. So two big powers in transition. Some argue that they're witnessing the last grasp of US supremacy, the equivalent of the British, 1955 US moment. China's wolf warrior diplomacy appears to be normative in its geopolitical ideology? And the third question is, how does these all affect Singapore? So I think you can just pick and choose the question you'd like to respond. Any questions you'd like to respond? Yeah. So perhaps I'll start. Could I just start with Brad? That this is about the US. Yeah.
Richard's question sort of encapsulates the entire discussion we're trying to have. Bill's book is quite good. I mean, it's a huge test. And the answer, to be very simple, the answer is unknown. The United States may rise to this challenge. I want to believe it's capable of doing so. It has the material capabilities, the if you will, the spiritual, the ideational capacity to do so. But the question is whether or not we will, in fact, be able to marshal the resources and the attention and do a couple of things at the same time, or whether we will be fatally distracted and forced to turn in on ourselves and tear ourselves apart. I mean, Professor Gao is right in noting that there are two United States in some ways, if not more. And the question is, as President Biden has noted, the challenge is for the United States to forge a national consensus that allows it to act in a unified way to face the challenges in so many dimensions. I believe we can rise to it, but the answer is by no means guaranteed.
Okay, and Beverly and Prof. Gao, would you like to respond to these three questions posed by Prof. Richard?
Sure. I think I'll just echo what Brad mentioned. I think a lot of countries want the US to take up this particular role, but I also agree with Prof. Gao in that I think there are a lot of, there's also a lot of global sentiment to do with US exceptionalism and also US exemptionalism, and therefore also the need for US to better understand these global sentiments about America's broader role. And I think I just want to very quickly highlight, I was just reading Dan Nexon's recent foreign affairs piece, and I think it's quite brilliant, right? He's basically arguing that, the US cannot just have geopolitical strategic competition as the end-all overarching ways in which it conducts its foreign policy with China and Russia, and that, geopolitical strategic competition is a means, right, not an end. And I think that will be important for the US moving forward, I think.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Gao, would you like to have your quick remark before we end the session? Yeah, very quickly, we have 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. Talking about Singapore, actually, Singapore by culture is a very hybrid, very unique culture in terms of the diversities of the world. And Singapore demonstrate a combination of the Oriental and the Western cultures. So I think the Chinese in the past decades learned a lot from Singapore style, and I sincerely wish Singapore would demonstrate a more glorious and a more promising future, and adding some new colors to the diversity of the world. Talking about international politics, I would always say, let's have a look at culture. Culture is very important, the key to open many, many doors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your all for all of your questions, and also for comments. And I think we enjoyed the discussion very much. And lastly, before we end, I would like to thank again to our speakers, Beverly, Prof. Gao, and Brad for their insightful analysis. I hope you can join us next time. We have upcoming webinars, so if if you're interested in our activities, please check out our website, www.rsis.edu.sg. So again, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.